So what do you guys think of the Stones coming and playing the Enmore Theatre?
It's great. They're playing in our backyard. Yeah, it's good.
Angus Young is not just a guitarist, he's a living symbol of everything rock and roll was meant to be. With his unmistakable schoolboy outfit, raw stage energy, and relentless guitar solos that seemed to pour straight out of his soul, Angus didn't just play rock music, he became its pulse. But most fans don't realize that behind that energy is a man with very strong opinions that are so controversial, they could shake up the very foundation of rock music. Because while the world worshipped certain legendary bands, Angus Young had some shocking and disturbing things to say about them. But what did these legendary bands possibly do to Angus? And why did he call them out in such a manner? Angus Young, the no-nonsense rock legend. When you hear the opening riffs of Back in Black or the raw thunder of Highway to Hell, you're not just listening to a rock song. You're stepping into the world of Angus Young, the explosive guitarist whose energy has powered AC/DC for 5 decades. Angus isn't just another lead guitarist, he's a rock icon, a pioneer, a living embodiment of hard rock at its loudest, rawest, and most unapologetic. From the very beginning, Angus Young stood out, not only for his aggressive, blues-influenced guitar playing, but also for his unforgettable stage persona. While most guitarists dressed in leather or denim, Angus appeared on stage in a private schoolboy uniform, complete with tie, blazer, shorts, and cap. But it wasn't a gimmick. It was a calculated rebellion, and a way to make himself instantly recognizable while paying tribute to his youth and his refusal to grow up. And once the music started, Angus transformed into a blur of movement, duck-walking across the stage like Chuck Berry, convulsing during solos and dropping to the floor for spinning tantrums. Yet the theatrics never overshadowed the music, because Angus Young is, at his core, a master of the riff. His playing is clean but powerful, wild but controlled. Critics often overlook the technicality of his work, but any guitarist who has attempted to replicate his solos or rhythm work knows the truth. What sounds simple in an AC/DC song is often devilishly precise and hard to reproduce. Angus built his style around the blues and rock and roll roots of the 50s and 60s, but he elevated it with sheer attitude. Under his musical leadership, AC/DC became one of the most successful rock bands in history. They've sold over 200 million albums worldwide. Back in Black alone has moved more than 50 million units, making it one of the best-selling albums of all time, rivaling Michael Jackson's Thriller and Pink Floyd's The Dark Side of the Moon. The band's sound was simple, with loud guitars, pounding drums, a growling frontman, and lyrics that had raw energy. But within that formula, they achieved consistency, identity, and a deep, unshakable connection with fans across generations. And this was something few other bands ever had. Over the years, Angus has also built a reputation for having strong opinions about music, especially about other bands in the rock space. He's not one to throw insults around in the press, and he's not known for starting public feuds. But when he does speak, people listen. Because for someone who has remained mostly private outside the stage lights, any insight into what Angus Young actually thinks carries weight. He's seen it all. He's played every festival, toured every continent, and shared lineups with legends. So when Angus doesn't like a band, it's not out of pettiness. It's usually rooted in something real, musical, cultural, or even deeply personal. And that's exactly why the bands he's openly criticized or refused to align with are worth talking about. Angus Young is not a rock diplomat, and he's not easily impressed. And that's why the names on this list are even more controversial. So who exactly has fallen out of Angus Young's favor over the years? Which bands, despite their popularity or influence, failed to impress the AC/DC mastermind? One of the most shocking names on this list has to be one of the greatest rock bands of all time, Led Zeppelin. Led Zeppelin. There are certain names in rock history that carry an almost mythological weight, and few are as towering or as untouchable as Led Zeppelin. From the late 1960s through the 70s, they weren't just a band. They were a movement. With Jimmy Page's haunting guitar riffs, Robert Plant's banshee-like wails, John Bonham's thunderous drumming, and John Paul Jones' elegant musicianship, Zeppelin built a sound that felt both ancient and futuristic. They filled stadiums, broke records, and cultivated a mystical image that other bands only dreamed of imitating. By the time Stairway to Heaven had become a generational anthem, Led Zeppelin had achieved the kind of dominance few artists ever touch. Their albums sold in the tens of millions. Their tours were chaotic, lavish, and historic. Critics didn't always understand them, but the fans did. To many, they were the most powerful live act of their era, the kind of band people traveled across continents just to see once. But Angus Young? He wasn't impressed. While many musicians in the hard rock and heavy metal world bowed to Zeppelin as pioneers, Angus stood apart. He had no problem acknowledging their success, but he refused to pretend their music or their performances moved him. In fact, his most candid comments about the band were surprisingly blunt and shocking. In an interview, Angus recalled seeing Led Zeppelin live and walking away with the resounding feeling of disappointment. He criticized their shows for being painfully slow, describing long stretches of their performance as dull and lacking energy. According to Angus, for much of their set, the band seemed to drift, playing long, meandering songs that left audiences stagnant and disengaged. He said, "I've seen that band live. They were on for 3 hours. For 2.5 hours, they bored the audience. Then at the end, they pull out old rock and roll numbers to get the crowd moving. They're supposed to be the most exciting rock and roll band in the world." That observation might seem small, but coming from someone like Angus Young, who treats every single minute on stage like it's a matter of life and death, it's a heavy statement. For Angus, live music was about energy, urgency, and a direct connection between the band and the audience. There was no room for drifting, no patience for drawn-out jams that led nowhere. And in his view, Led Zeppelin, despite their immense reputation, often missed the mark on stage when it mattered most. But that's not to say he denied their technical skill. Angus never insulted the band's musicianship or songwriting outright. His issue wasn't that Led Zeppelin wasn't talented, it was that, in his eyes, they didn't translate that talent into something consistently engaging when they performed live. And for a performer like Angus, who burned through every set with unrelenting speed and precision, that failure was unforgivable. He wasn't alone in this view either. While Zeppelin's studio work is almost universally praised, even some die-hard fans have admitted that the band's live shows could sometimes drift into self-indulgence. Extended solos, experimental arrangements, and long improvisational detours were common in Zeppelin concerts. That might have thrilled certain audiences, but not Angus. So while most of the rock world put Led Zeppelin on a pedestal, Angus wasn't exactly a fan. He respected what they represented, but not what they delivered. In his mind, Zeppelin had all the ingredients for greatness, but somehow failed to ignite them when it mattered most. And for someone as relentless as Angus Young, that was the ultimate sin. But just when you think that was the most surprising name on the list, Angus took a jab at another band with an entirely different philosophy. They were fast, loud, stripped down, and proud of it. But that didn't win them any points in Angus's book either. The Ramones. When people talk about the birth of punk rock, the conversation almost always circles back to the Ramones. Formed in Queens, New York in 1974, they were rough, loud, and unapologetically simple. Their songs were fast and stripped down, usually clocking in at under 2 minutes with no solos or overproduction. For millions, the Ramones were heroes. They stood in direct opposition to the overblown, stadium-sized rock acts of the 70s. They wore ripped jeans and leather jackets instead of sequined jumpsuits. They didn't talk politics, they just played fast and got off stage. In doing so, they helped give rise to the punk explosion that would sweep through the UK and echo into the alternative scenes of the 80s and beyond. But for Angus Young, all of that noise amounted to nothing. And he didn't sugarcoat it either. When asked about the Ramones and the punk rock wave that followed them, Angus didn't offer polite industry praise. He dismissed the Ramones in plain terms, and then he took it even further, comparing their sound to the very first band he was in at age 12, saying, "They've got nothing going for them except the visual thing. The Ramones, I only heard them once. I heard a song and it did nothing. It seemed to me like the first band I was ever in, and I'm sure even that was better. And it was when I was 12. That kind of comment might seem harsh, but it wasn't just about ego or competition. Angus's disdain went deeper than one band. It was about a broader frustration with what punk represented to him. In his view, punk rock wasn't just raw, it was often lazy. He criticized many punk musicians for their lack of skill, arguing that some couldn't even properly tune their instruments, let alone play them. And in a world where Angus Young practiced relentlessly to perfect every note on stage, that kind of sloppiness wasn't rebellious, it was insulting. For him, great music wasn't just about attitude, it was about craft. And while the Ramones wore their lack of polish like a badge of honor, Angus saw that as a cop-out. In his eyes, you didn't break the rules until you'd first learned them. That's not to say Angus didn't appreciate raw energy. In fact, he compared them to other bands that had that same level of energy. But there's a key difference. And Angus believed bands like the Ramones used simplicity to cover up the fact that they had little musical range in the first place. He said, "I don't know if you remember when Steve Marriott used to come on and wipe his nose, spit in his hand, and pour beer over the crowd and the whole thing like that. They can do all that. It's pretty easy for a guy to go up there and do all that, but they can't play." Everyone knows that at that time Steve Marriott could sing and the band, the Small Faces, could play. Well, the bands that are there now can't play and they can't sing. And it wasn't just about skill. Angus questioned the punk movement's self-proclaimed authenticity. While punk fans saw themselves as anti-establishment outsiders, Angus thought the scene quickly devolved into another formula and brand entirely. To him, it wasn't breaking new ground. It was just chaos dressed up as rebellion. Despite his views, it's worth noting that the Ramones themselves admired AC/DC. In fact, many punk bands respected what AC/DC represented, a pure, no-frills commitment to rock. But the feeling wasn't mutual. For Angus, the Ramones simply didn't measure up, either as musicians or as performers. And once again, Angus wasn't afraid to say so. But next on his list is a band with serious chops and an iconic name that Angus actually respected musically, but still found reasons to call out: the Pistols. In the late 1970s, no band embodied chaos quite like the Pistols. With ripped shirts, spiked hair, and sneers that seemed carved into their faces, they stormed into the British music scene like a Molotov cocktail. Their music was angry, messy, and defiantly unpolished. Songs like Anarchy in the UK and God Save the Queen weren't just tracks. They were anthems of rebellion. But to Angus Young, the Sex Pistols were less about revolution and more about recklessness. From day one, Angus had very little patience for the punk movement, and the Sex Pistols, in his eyes, embodied everything wrong with it. While they were hailed as dangerous, groundbreaking, and provocative, Angus simply saw them as loud, undisciplined, and musically unimpressive. Their attitude, in his opinion, came from a place of deliberate incompetence, not innovation. It wasn't just that they couldn't play, though Angus did believe many of them couldn't. It was that they didn't even try. He was vocal about how punk rock, and particularly the Sex Pistols, celebrated mediocrity under the banner of rebellion. Where Angus had spent years perfecting his craft, practicing guitar for hours, fine-tuning live shows, and delivering consistency, he lamented that punk bands like the Pistols seemed to pride themselves on sloppiness. But it wasn't just the music that rubbed him the wrong way, it was also the behavior. One incident that particularly stuck with Angus was the Sex Pistols' infamous appearance on the Today Show in the UK in 1976. It was supposed to be a routine promotional interview. Instead, it became one of the most notorious moments in British television history. With host Bill Grundy pushing their buttons, the band fired back with a string of profanity-laced remarks live on air. It was vulgar and unapologetic, and it got them banned from future media appearances for a while. To some punk fans, that moment was iconic, but to Angus, it left a bad taste. That kind of public spectacle didn't make the Sex Pistols bold. It made them irresponsible. In fact, he later admitted that incidents like that one hurt other rock bands too, especially those who were trying to maintain respectability in the eyes of television networks and booking agents. After the Pistols' stunt, the entire genre was looked at with suspicion, and his own band, AC/DC, despite being entirely different, often got lumped into the same bucket. That association, in his mind, wasn't just unfair, it was damaging. It made it harder for real rock musicians, the ones who actually cared about performance, discipline, and connection with fans, to be taken seriously. Things got heated when Angus's band was banned from playing in certain cities in the United Kingdom. AC/DC were banned from Glasgow, and were also banned from playing at Liverpool Stadium. Reacting to the Liverpool Stadium ban, Angus casually said, "Never mind, they'll open up again to us when they're losing money." In other words, the Pistols weren't just ruining their own reputation, they were staining the genre for everyone else. And while AC/DC has always walked the line of rebellion, Angus never believed in causing chaos just for the sake of headlines. He believed rock was supposed to challenge the norm, but with musicianship, not just profanity. He believed in letting the music speak for itself. And if a band had to rely on outrageous interviews or staged fights to get attention, then maybe the music wasn't strong enough to stand on its own. For Angus, the Sex Pistols were proof that not all rebellion was created equal. Their sound lacked the technical grounding he respected. Their attitude felt manufactured. And their impact, rather than lifting rock into a new era, only made the public more suspicious of it. Despite the Sex Pistols' massive influence on punk culture, Angus never bought into the myth. To him, they weren't heroes, they were distractions. And while they've since been inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, Angus likely wouldn't be lining up to offer congratulations. Next up on his list is a group that's polished, theatrical, and commercial to the core. They wore face paint, spat fire, and turned every concert into a circus. But to Angus Young, all the makeup in the world couldn't cover up what he really thought of them. Yes Band. In the sprawling world of 1970s rock, Yes stood at the summit of what came to be known as progressive rock. Their music was ambitious, experimental, and highly technical, and it was characterized by long, complex compositions, shifting time signatures, and elaborate instrumental solos. With albums like Fragile, Close to the Edge, and Tales from Topographic Oceans, Yes pushed rock far beyond its traditional boundaries. They weren't writing radio singles, they were crafting sonic landscapes, often stretching one track across an entire album side. For fans of progressive rock, Yes were gods. John Anderson's ethereal vocals, Rick Wakeman's wizard-like command of keyboards, Steve Howe's intricate guitar work, and Chris Squire's powerful bass playing combined to create something almost otherworldly. But for Angus Young, it was all a bit too much. Angus never hid his distaste for progressive rock, and Yes in particular became the target of his sharp criticism. While he didn't deny their technical skill, because he knew how hard their music was to play, he just didn't see the point of it. Angus believed rock music was meant to hit hard, move fast, and stay rooted in raw emotion. And when he listened to Yes, what he heard was the opposite. Long-winded arrangements, overly intellectual lyrics, and meandering solos that felt more like musical math equations than songs. In one interview, Angus summed it up bluntly by saying they were boring. I don't know anybody who's gone to see any of those serious bands who've enjoyed it. They may say it was great, that the music was good, but somewhere during that set they were bored and were too scared to admit it. If I went to see somebody that was musical, I'd yawn my head off. I'd end up walking out to the bar. Bands like Yes would be a bore to see. But it wasn't just an offhand comment. It was his honest reaction to music that, for all its complexity, didn't connect with him emotionally or physically. For someone like Angus, who built his entire career on punchy riffs, gut-level energy, and adrenaline-fueled shows, Yes felt like the kind of band that made music to impress themselves, not to move an audience. And that was a serious offense in Angus's book. He once described progressive rock bands as too self-indulgent, and he saw Yes as musicians who spent more time in the studio crafting 10-minute tracks with 17 tempo changes than they did actually connecting with the crowd. To Angus, music wasn't meant to be a puzzle, it was meant to be a fire. You had to feel it instantly, in your chest, not analyze it line by line. Yes, in his view, rock turned into homework. Even the spectacle of their performances didn't appeal to him. While Yes shows were known for elaborate lighting, mystical stage setups, and dazzling musicianship, Angus found it all cold and distant. There was no grit, sweat, or soul, just polish and perfection. And to Angus Young, that wasn't rock and roll. In an interview, he said, "Yes, we would probably come on with a fantastic light show. I've never seen them, but they probably use a light show to cover up that they're bored. Their music is boring, and they're not making people jump." Of course, many would argue the exact opposite, that yes, we're too soulful, too deeply artistic to be dismissed. But Angus wasn't looking for philosophy in his rock bands. He was looking for power and immediacy. And yes, with their sprawling suites and fantasy imagery, they felt far too safe and far too removed from the raw roots of blues and boogie that had shaped Angus's musical core. So, despite their monumental influence on progressive rock, their Grammy nominations, and decades of loyal fans, Yes never made it onto Angus's personal playlist. But just when you think the shots couldn't get any more unexpected, Angus takes aim at a band many consider hard rock royalty. And this time it's personal. Deep Purple. To most rock fans, Deep Purple stands tall among the architects of hard rock and heavy metal. Their blend of heavy riffs, dramatic organs, and soaring vocals helped define the sound of the 1970s. Albums like Machine Head and songs like Smoke on the Water earned them a spot in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame and in the hearts of millions of fans around the world. But to Angus Young, their music didn't hit nearly as hard. In one interview, Angus didn't hold back. He admitted bluntly, "I never liked those Deep Purples or those sorts of things." He even went a step further, dismissing them as nothing more than a poor man's Led Zeppelin. That comment alone ruffled feathers, not just because of who Deep Purple was, but because it revealed just how little Angus thought of their originality. It wasn't that he thought Deep Purple lacked talent. The band's members, after all, were known for their technical abilities, but for Angus, technicality meant nothing without soul. He believed Deep Purple leaned too heavily on elaborate solos and dramatic flourishes, rather than the kind of raw, stripped-down power that AC/DC championed. He recalled going to see them live once, paying for a ticket, expecting to be blown away, and walking out with nothing but disappointment. Speaking about the experience, he said, "I saw Deep Purple live once and I paid money for it and I thought, geez, this is ridiculous. You just see through all that sort of stuff." To Angus, it all came down to energy. Not lights, not volume, not technique, but that primal, gut-punch force that could shake an audience without needing a 10-minute solo to do it. In his view, Deep Purple missed the mark. In calling them a poor man's Zeppelin, Angus wasn't just making a comparison. He was drawing a line in the sand. Both bands were known for heavy riffs and explosive performances, but where Zeppelin, in his view at least, tried to innovate, Deep Purple felt like a lesser echo of the same ambition, without the substance to back it up. It was a harsh critique, but very in character for Angus. But the next band on Angus's list is a band that most people would assume he admired. They helped define rock and roll. They've influenced generations, and they practically wrote the book on swagger. But even they weren't safe from Angus Young's sharp opinions. The Rolling Stones. It's almost unthinkable to imagine anyone from the rock world taking a jab at the Rolling Stones. With a career spanning over 6 decades, they've been hailed as the greatest rock and roll band in the world, credited with shaping the very foundation of modern rock. Their swagger, their riffs, and their stage presence carved out a blueprint for what a rock band should be. But for Angus Young, the legendary guitarist of AC/DC, the legacy of the Rolling Stones came with a major asterisk. Angus grew up admiring early rock and roll, and like many, he once respected the Stones for their raw energy and blues roots. In their early years, the Rolling Stones had delivered albums like Let It Bleed and Sticky Fingers, which were filled with gritty guitars, sleazy grooves, and unapologetic rock anthems. But somewhere along the way, Angus believed the band lost their edge. And to him, the Stones didn't evolve. They drifted. In one of his more pointed remarks, Angus stated that the Rolling Stones had progressed the wrong way musically. It wasn't just a matter of changing with the times. Angus felt they had stepped away from the core of what made them great and moved into territory that didn't suit them. He took specific issue with their increasing lean toward soul music, a style that he believed the Stones simply weren't meant to play. He bluntly said, "The Rolling Stones get up and play soul music these days. This is supposed to be rock and roll. Leave that to the people who do it best, the black people. If the Stones played what they do best, they'd be a lot better. They'd probably find themselves at ease." For Angus, It was like watching a prize fighter try ballet. It might be well-intentioned, but ultimately misguided. It didn't sound authentic. And worse, it didn't sound like the Rolling Stones. Part of Angus's frustration came from his deep belief in artistic identity. AC/DC had built their brand on unwavering consistency. They weren't interested in chasing trends or reinventing themselves with each album. Angus saw value in staying true to your roots, in mastering a particular sound instead of constantly trying to be something new. And in his eyes, the Stones' willingness to experiment wasn't brave. It was a detour from greatness. While critics might celebrate the Stones' genre-hopping and stylistic evolution, Angus saw it as dilution and symptoms of a band that had lost confidence in what made them legendary in the first place. And then came the most blunt and unforgettable quote of all. When asked about attending a Rolling Stones concert, Angus quipped that he would yawn his head off if he had to sit through a Rolling Stones concert. It was a brutal remark, especially considering the global reputation of the Stones' live shows with massive stadiums, fireworks, and decades of hits. But Angus wasn't impressed by the spectacle alone. He wanted grit, power, and intensity on stage. To him, a show wasn't successful because the lights were bright or the crowd was big. It was about whether the music hit hard enough to rattle your bones. And by that measure, he didn't think the Stones still delivered. This wasn't about personal rivalry or tabloid drama. It was about what Angus considered to be authentic rock and roll. He respected artists who knew their lane and stayed in it, not because of limitation, but because of conviction. To Angus, the Stones had the right ingredients, but started chasing flavors that didn't belong in their kitchen. That doesn't mean he dismissed the band's historical impact altogether. Angus understood the Stones were pioneers. He acknowledged their early role in bringing blues-based rock to a mainstream audience, but he believed they had strayed too far from that raw, bluesy energy and had wandered into sounds that lacked punch. And in doing so, they became something he no longer recognized or enjoyed. It was a controversial stance, especially given the reverence most artists have for the Stones. But that's the thing about Angus Young. He's not interested in following the crowd or praising legends just because they're legends. He says what he thinks, and even if it raises eyebrows, he sticks by it. In the end, his critiques of bands like Led Zeppelin, the Ramones, the Sex Pistols, yes, Deep Purple, and the Rolling Stones aren't just a list of grievances. They reveal something deeper about Angus himself, his standards, his tastes, and his unwavering loyalty to rock and roll in its purest, loudest, most unfiltered form. Because for Angus Young, music isn't about trends. It's not about fame or fashion or reinvention. It's about plugging in, turning up, and making the ground shake. And if a band loses sight of that, no matter how iconic they are, he won't hesitate to call it out. What do you think? What band on this list shocked you the most? Tell us in the comment section below. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to click on the next video on your screen, like this video, and subscribe to our channel for more updates.